of children with disabilities. And through Proyecto Acceso, we have the helpline, which Laura runs at MAC, specifically for Spanish-speaking parents, which is free of charge. And focusing in the areas, we respond to questions from families in the areas of special education, student discipline, and bullying in schools. In limited cases, we're also able to provide direct legal advocacy to families through Proyecto Acceso. And Laura and I are joined today with Lilia Malikshi, our MAC's communications manager, who will go over some logistics.
Hi everyone, hola, thank you for joining us today. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know which agency or organization you're with. Make sure you've selected panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your message. Thank you to everyone who said hello already. So a few logistical notes: closed captions and live transcription are available today. Just click the live transcription button on your Zoom menu to turn that feature on or off. I'll be sharing MAC resources in the chat box throughout the webinar. We encourage all of you to chat and share your own helpful resources in the chat box. We want to keep this as interactive and helpful for you as possible, so do use that chat box for resource sharing. But please use the Q&A button for questions you'd like us to answer. We'll pause for questions throughout the webinar, and you can submit your question at any point using that Q&A button. Lastly, if you help us help you, we see someone else. If you see someone else's question that you'd like us to answer, give it a like in the Q&A so it can be bumped up the list. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lilia. And before we start, I just wanted to mention a little bit about why we are doing this webinar, which is actually our 5th annual webinar focused on special education rights of immigrant students and families. So as you know, immigrant families and students are a population who face significant barriers and historically have been underserved. During recent years, immigrants have had to contend with increasingly harsh immigration policy and increasing anti-immigrant sentiment. And then COVID came and brought devastation to many immigrant communities and deepening anti-immigrant sentiment, in particular directed at Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. So we're not immigration attorneys, nor do we pretend to be experts in immigration law and policy, but we do know that one effect of all of these forces is to impose barriers to immigrant parent access to the special education process. Immigrants feel reluctant to interact with government agencies, including schools and school districts, which inhibits participation in the special education process. We know that parent participation results in better access to services for students with disabilities. So we see it as a priority to support these families in any way that we can. And here we have a webinar overview. We'll start by talking about immigrant parent and student rights, parents and the special education process. We'll talk about the first step in the special education process, which is requesting evaluations, both school and independent. We'll talk about step 2 in the process, which is the special education team meeting. Step 3, which is the Individualized Education Program, or the IEP. Throughout the webinar, we'll talk about the implications of COVID on access to special education services, but we'll also be talking about that briefly at the end of the workshop. And we'll also be talking about what to do when parents disagree with the school district and resources that are available to families. And here we have the goals of the webinar. First, we will one goal is to learn how laws can protect immigrant children and English learners in the special education process, and learn tools that parents who are immigrants or have limited English proficiency can use to be part of the special education process and get needed services for their children. And just a comment regarding, why we see that it is so important to do this webinar for direct service providers. You all are an invaluable source of support for families. We know that many of you attend team meetings with families, that you provide emotional support and help navigating all of the many systems that parents of children with disabilities are navigating every day of their lives to ensure that their children get what they need. We're only able to assist some families directly, so frequently we'll get calls to our helpline from you all as community direct service providers. So we really want to support you in any way that we can, and really to recognize the important work that you do with families. And here, I won't go through each of these, but this slide lists the legal protections that immigrant students and immigrant parents have in special education under federal law, including both special education law and also laws protecting immigrants from discrimination, and state law that applies both to students with disabilities and also English learner students. Something that is important to keep in mind throughout this entire webinar is that the right to a free and appropriate public education, which is what the law requires for eligible students with disabilities, applies to all eligible students with disabilities, regardless of their immigration status. So even through the years, as some immigrant protections have been impacted by policy changes, the right to a public education has not been impacted at all, and remains that way. Although frequently the messages can become muddled due to the anti-immigrant sentiment that is just so pervasive now. And just a quick note about COVID and special education. The laws also, Lily, if you wouldn't mind just going back to the last one, I just wanted to make one comment that all of these laws continue to apply during COVID similarly. But in some cases, districts have had to adjust the way that they deliver services to account for health and safety precautions. So as I mentioned earlier, throughout the webinar, we'll be addressing the application of special education law during COVID, and also this transition back to in-person learning that is going on now. But just to have that in mind, that there have been some many guidances actually issued by the State Department of Education that address services for students with disabilities during COVID. But these core laws that really form the basis of all of the information that we'll present today in this webinar are, remain in place despite COVID. And just to make the comment, which I always feel like we have to say, in that parents are important in the special education process. I feel like you all recognize that parents are important, and but frequently parents don't understand how important they are in the context of their children's education, and especially special education. Parents know their children best of anybody, and also have known them since they were born, and have seen, how they've grown and developed. And it isn't just me saying this, it's the law that has established that parents are equal members of the special education team. All written letters, forms, and evaluation reports must be in the parent's primary language. And all meetings must be held in the parent's primary language using an interpreter if the parent prefers. And the process also requires parent consent during certain key points in order to move forward. So this is the law, but also important to recognize, and as many of you I'm sure have seen in practice, it doesn't always happen in practice.
Yeah, and it's also, yes, parents are very important. That what we've seen from our families that we work with, that many times parents feel overwhelmed. They feel shy about, I have all these professionals in the school talking about my child. They know my child, they are the experts. And then for parents never to forget that they are the real experts on their child. And especially now during COVID, where our kids have been home 24/7, and we've had the opportunity to see our kids, how they in behavior, in how they learn, how long can they be sitting and doing homework, how many breaks they need throughout the day. So many things that we've been able to see in our kids and in their learning while they're home. This is very important information to bring to the team in the school. It's key information the school doesn't have. And so we've, as parents, we've always been the experts on our child, but now we have that new perspective of seeing our child learn at home and understanding his or her needs, and sharing that with the team is important.
And one more place, that's a really good point, Lauda, and it makes me think that one additional place where it is recognized that parent participation and input is important, especially during COVID, is explicitly in guidance that has been issued by the State Department of Education during this time. So if you see families, and we'll talk a little bit more about COVID compensatory services and compensatory services in general because of COVID, it's important to really push back if the school district has said, and I've seen this in a few different cases, that they can't issue compensatory services or make a decision on compensatory services because the student hasn't been accessing remote learning. And that's just not the case. In fact, the reality of the student not being able to access remote learning is right there. That's evidence, that the student requires compensatory services, and you have the parent input. So there actually is data to pull from in making that determination. So that's just one more example, of many that highlight the importance of parent participation. And when a parent's primary language is not English, just to really emphasize this, the law requires trained and qualified interpreters at all team meetings, and it is not enough for the interpreter to be bilingual. Although that is a requirement that the interpreter be bilingual, they also must be trained in the specialized terminology that's used in special education, trained in the ethics of interpretation and the role of the interpreter, and also confidentiality. The law also requires that IEPs, evaluation reports, and school notices be provided in the parent's primary language if they prefer that. Unfortunately, this frequently isn't the case, and actually we have a poll. Lily, while I'm talking, if you want to post the poll, just to ask you if you have concerns, if you've experienced concerns with the quality of interpretation at team meetings, and we'll go back to that. But
yeah, and while people respond, what we have seen is that we ask the parents, do you have an interpreter at the meeting? They'll say yes, but if you keep asking, it turns out that the interpreter is the person who works at the office or another teacher who is bilingual. That should not be the case, and parents should know that the person who works in the office and happens to be bilingual is not a qualified interpreter. And if at any point during the meeting parents feel that they can understand the interpreter, They feel like they're not getting all the information. They have the right to speak out and stop the meeting and reconvene the meeting when the school has a qualified interpreter.
That's right. And if school staff have gone through training to become interpreters, then they can interpret in team meetings, but so many times, I would say more often than not, and I don't usually say that, they haven't been through the training that's needed and are not qualified to serve in the role of interpreters. So can we show the poll results? Okay, so that's always 36%. That's, yeah, I mean, that's, I would.
Yes, 90% at some point, between
Exactly.
sometimes and always is 90%. That's, yeah.
Exactly.
That's very telling.
Absolutely. And I can't say that I'm surprised by those poll results. So if there are some options, if you see, or if you have a family that's coming to you and they're concerned about the quality of the interpretation at a team meeting, there is the option of filing a complaint with the State Department of Education problem resolution system. And they actually have a system now where you can, if it's in English and Spanish, we're working on getting the other languages up. But you can actually file a complaint using your smartphone, which is convenient for many families, and in fact is the only way to access that kind of technology for many families. So there's the website here to do that, to file a complaint. I would suggest that you contact Mcas helpline for some guidance before doing that, and we can kind of guide you through what is most important to include in that complaint to DESE, whether it's the school district hasn't translated something or hasn't provided a qualified interpreter.
Yes, and I also wanted to point out that the evaluations and school notices, the parents is supposed to receive this information in their language before the meeting. We've seen that sometimes they send the evaluations in English and said, well, we haven't translated, at some point, and they go ahead with the meeting. Parents need to have all the information in their language before the meeting.
Yeah. Okay, and so we'll stop here for questions.
All right, so yeah, we've had a few questions come in. I'll get right into it. First question is, do you know of any organizations that offer low cost or free translators?
I do. I know in terms of translations, I know of an organization that for nonprofits does offer some free translations up to a certain point. And I can provide that information if you just include your email in the chat or send me an email after the webinar, even better, but I can direct you to them. So, I mean, that's a resource for some nonprofits. But yes, cost is an issue. Interpretation and translation is expensive, and it takes work to coordinate. It needs to be, kind of part of the planning process, for meetings automatically. And unfortunately, it often isn't. But I can provide that information if you send me an email after the webinar.
Great, thank you. And I see you shared your email with us, so we'll follow up with you. Next, we have a few people who have asked is it written in the law that evaluation reports must be in the parent's native language? I'd like to quote the law to the school system. So is it the evaluation reports? Does the evaluation need to be performed in the native language, or is it just the paperwork that needs to be given in the native language? And is that a law that they could cite?
And we're going to get into evaluations later in the presentation.
Yeah, we'll talk about the language that the evaluations need to be completed in terms of the law and evaluation reports. The Massachusetts there are a few laws that do require it. But under special education law, Massachusetts regulations do say that all communications And then I'll paraphrase from there, but must be provided in the parent's home language. So an evaluation report would absolutely constitute a communication in special education law. If you get any pushback on that, absolutely let us know, and we can talk through that. But that's one area of the law.
And it's good that you're saying that, Diana, that is all communication, because it's not only evaluations and invitation to the team meeting, it's every communication. Like the teacher is going to communicate with the parent. They have to call the parent with an interpreter. If they're going to send an email to the parent, it has to be in their language. So it's any way of communication with the parent has to be in their language.
Thank you.
Yeah, and during COVID, just one point, in terms of translation and interpretation during COVID, we've seen that with parents serving as their children's teachers and occupational therapists and speech therapists, and really guiding their learning during this time in many cases, and many families who are deciding to keep their children home for remote learning, through the end of the school year and maybe through the summer also. That adds to the district's obligation really to provide interpretation and translation to support the remote learning. If the parent needs their child's schedule translated, for example, then the school district is obligated to translate their child's schedule. Or if they need an interpreter to check in, more regularly than they typically would with the teacher or somebody else who's working with their child from the school, then the district must provide an interpreter for those communications.
I think we're going to get to some of this information, so.
Okay, do we continue?
Yeah.
Okay, so here we have the special education process and timelines, and I think many of you are probably familiar to some extent, with the special education process and many of these steps. But the way that we'll go through each of the steps is starting with step 1, which is the referral for a special education evaluation, which goes to step 2, the team meeting, and on to step 3, which is that the parents receive the IEP and the parents respond to the IEP. And throughout this timeline, there are very specific timelines that the district must comply with, which is a really important protection for parents to ensure that their children, that they get a response from the district, and that their children get the services that they need as soon as possible.
Yeah, I know indeed the timeline is the same during COVID. So COVID should not be an excuse to make changes in the timeline. It's all the same during COVID, during remote hybrid learning.
Okay, so just to say a little bit about evaluations, anyone can make a referral for an evaluation. This can be for a student who doesn't have an IEP, where there's some concerns that are coming up at school, that that the parent or somebody else who has knowledge of the child thinks that there may be a need for special education for that child to be able to access their learning. Also for students who are already in special education, there may be a new area of suspected disability. For example, there might be a new behavior, or the student might continue to struggle despite services being offered through the IEP, which might be reasons for a referral to be made for a student who's already receiving special education. So upon receipt of that referral, the district must issue a consent form within 5 school days, and within 30 days of getting the parents' consent in writing for the evaluation, they must complete the evaluation. And for students who are already in special education, this process should happen every 3 years, if not sooner. In the case, for example, that a new issue comes up and there's a need for a new evaluation within those 3 years.
Yeah, and also important for you as service providers and for parents to understand that they can, or you can make a referral as many times as is needed. Like we've seen now during COVID that we have students now with new difficulties, new challenges. Some kids are naturally very anxious to go back to school, or now they have different behavioral issues, or a new learning difficulty. So we need to be mindful that now with the kids going back to school, it might be a kid with a slight different profile, a kid who has needs that didn't have before. So at that point, we can again do a referral and then go through the evaluation process, and then just the idea is to make sure that the IEP really reflects the strengths and needs of the student at the moment, not the student that we had before COVID.
And as you can imagine, there are many different types of students and many different types of learning styles. There are many different types of evaluations, and the law does require certain assessments for the initial evaluation and the 3-year reevaluations, which include the educational assessment, evaluations in all areas of suspected disability. So for example, if the student is showing some difficulties kind of socializing, maybe avoiding socializing with peers, or there have been some issues identified, in that area with social skills, the school district should do a speech and language evaluation focused on social language pragmatics. If the student, maybe have some sensory issue, maybe it's a student with a disability who has some behaviors in the classroom, and the team is uncertain about what is causing those behaviors. They may want to do an occupational therapy evaluation to identify the presence of some kind of a sensory issue that's impacting that student's ability to learn. And those are just a couple of examples of, evaluations in areas of suspected disability. The district can also do the psychological evaluation, a home assessment or health assessment at the parent's request, or with, the parent's consent, if the district is proposing to do those evaluations. And for students with disabilities starting at age 14, the district must also do a transition and a functional vocational assessment, which is often a series of assessments. It's not like there's one transition assessment, but that's starting at age 14 to determine in what areas that student has skills that need to be developed, areas of interest to be identified, and what kinds of experiences the student will need to be able to transition successfully out of high school, whether that's to go to college or to go to get a job, and really to live independently after high school. All parents, we have a question that came up also.
Yeah, related to COVID, and just making sure that evaluations should not be delayed because of COVID. Some evaluations can be done remotely, and we know that districts and are doing evaluations in person, taking all the precautions, of course, but they can be done. So just making sure that COVID is not an excuse to be delaying evaluation.
Yeah, that's a really important point that we've been seeing also since the beginning of COVID. And now the districts are, from what I'm seeing, for the most part, they're doing the evaluations in person, even if the student is learning remotely. So they're really, there's really no reason not to that COVID should delay the evaluations. Now is just as a note, now is the time of the year when it's really important to get in referrals for evaluations and consent forms, just to make sure that they're done before the end of the school year in preparation for the new school year, just to have that in mind, working with families. Okay, so 81%, yes, have seen evaluations delayed because of COVID. So
Yeah.
something to be looking out for. And just to really quickly finish with the content here, if parents want to observe, or you as a community service provider think it would be helpful to observe the student at school, maybe there are certain patterns or behaviors that are being reported by the school district that are not consistent with what's going on at home. Just to give one example, an observation can be really helpful, whether it's an observation remotely or an in-person observation. The law does entitle parents to observations, or to have someone to request that somebody else observe their child, somebody from outside of the district. And all testing should happen in the language most likely to accurately assess what the child knows and could do academically, developmentally, and functionally. And so for English learners, it's really important to identify what language will achieve that, will most accurately assess what the child knows. And speaking of English learners, so as I just said, the testing must be done in the language of the child, if that is of the first language of the child, if that's not English, if that's what's needed to accurately assess what the child knows. Testing must be done in a non-discriminatory manner, so that there isn't, and this comes up with English learners, sometimes if there's not a testing instrument that's really culturally appropriate for the student, then the school district might need to identify alternative assessments, alternative ways to assess that student, to ensure that it's not being done in a non-discriminatory manner. It's not just necessarily a question of translating or interpreting word for word and evaluation. All students identified as English learners must be tested yearly for English proficiency, apart from their testing based on disability. That's called ELD, or English language development level. And as we mentioned earlier, evaluation reports must be provided in the parent's primary language, if they prefer, the parent prefers. Of course, we've talked about the evaluations. Evaluations are crucial for informing what services and accommodations the student may require to be able to access school, to be able to learn in school and make progress. So, sometimes the parent will not agree with the school evaluation. And those are the parents that we often see contacting our Mcas helpline. And it may be that the evaluation isn't really complete, doesn't fully capture everything that the student needs, or all of the issues that the student is experiencing at school because of their disability. And it may be that the evaluation is just, the parent feels the evaluation is wrong, like they actually disagree with the content of the evaluation. Whatever the case is, the parent has a right to request an independent evaluation, which is like a second opinion evaluation. And there's so many cases where it's the independent evaluation that really turns things around for the student, where the team is just, the parent is pushing and pushing, and the school district won't budge on their position. The parent seeks out the second opinion evaluation, presents it to the team, and all of a sudden, the student, that parent is able to successfully advocate for what the student needs to be able to learn in school. It's always nice when it works out that way anyway, and it does on occasion, that's all that's needed, really to turn things around in school. There is also an option under the law to request that the school district fund an independent evaluation in this slide, and you'll have these for later to refer to, but there are two ways to request that the district fund the independent evaluation. Parents also have the option of seeking out evaluations privately. They're very expensive, but some do accept insurance, and some do accept even Mass Health. So it's very important to know about.
Yeah, and we need to emphasize that the importance of evaluations, because the IEP is developed based on evaluations. So we as parents, we might, I know what my child is struggling with, but unfortunately that's not enough to make changes to the IEP or to ask the school to develop an IEP. So what we see many times is that the school does an evaluation and then they implement an IEP, and weeks later the students still struggling. That should be a sign that we're missing something. And this is where the independent evaluation comes in. When we feel like even though the school did an evaluation, the students still not making progress. So what are we missing? And we go into the independent evaluation. So in general terms, for the parents, if they disagree with the findings of the evaluation, or they just read the evaluation and it feels that the evaluation doesn't really describe the student, then, or the child keeps struggling, those are good reasons to request an independent evaluation.
So we'll see if there are any questions.
We do have some questions. Our first question is, what resources are out there for assistance and guidance for English language learner families and access testing in Mcas?
In terms of English learners with disabilities, there are accommodations that districts can be required to provide in terms of taking the access test is the test to assess English proficiency. And that's the test that's conducted yearly for English learner students. And so there is actually a version of the access test for students with disabilities that's sometimes used. But if the student does need accommodations because of a disability, those can be listed in the IEP explicitly, or a 504 plan if the student has a 504 plan. And that's the same is true for the Mcas, that those accommodations can be made available to the student.
Thank you. Next question. For interpretation requirements, does the law apply to any language the parent prefers, or does the law specify specific languages that require interpreters?
It's what the law says. It's really whichever language the parent prefers. And I think, to the extent feasible or something like that. It says federal law, uses that phrase. And I think, so this applies, regardless of the language of the parent. It's hard to think of a situation where it's not feasible to identify a spoken language interpreter who can interpret for the family, even if it's used by phone, which isn't really ideal, to have a phone interpreter, but if that's what's available, then that needs to be made available to the parents. I mean, occasionally we've had cases with certain indigenous languages, like in Mexico, so Mayan languages, where it's been very hard to find interpreters, but it is regardless of the language of the parent for the most part. If the school district is saying that it's not feasible to provide an interpreter in a particular case, definitely call Max helpline and we can kind of brainstorm what options there might be for ensuring that parent is able to fully participate.
Thank you. And please, we've got a lot of questions coming in. If you see a question that you like, give it a thumbs up to bump it up the list. I apologize, that feature wasn't turned on before, but I just turned it on, so you can now vote for questions. Our next question is, we often encounter the situation you described where the evaluation reports or notice are not in the primary language, but if the family requests translations, it significantly delays the IEP meeting and start of services. Is there any law protecting the timeliness of translation of reports and not delaying the IEP meeting?
So the law, and I know this problem well, very well. The law does not allow additional time to school districts to complete evaluations. So really, there's nothing to say, well, districts can have an extra 2 or 3 weeks, if the IEP needs to be translated, and that's okay for the student to wait 2 or 3 weeks, to get the services that they need to be able to learn in school. I think it can be really important for parents to be proactive here, in really pushing the district to get the evaluations on time. It's kind of, frequently, not always, but it's the squeaky wheel, that gets the response from the school district in terms of the timely translation of IEPs. But really, it requires advanced planning by school districts, in terms of the deadlines for evaluators to get their reports in English, so that they can have time for them to be translated. So, it can be useful for the parent to really highlight as much as they can that they need the evaluations on time. This would be a basis for filing a PRS complaint. That's the complaint with the State Department of State Department of Education Problem Resolution System. If evaluations are not, or evaluation reports are not issued in a timely way in the parent's language. The issue there is that it takes 60 days to resolve a complaint, a PRS complaint. So I often, suggest to families that they request in writing multiple times. You as community direct service providers can also do that, to request to get the evaluations on time. Even so, unfortunately, there are going to be many instances where it doesn't happen, despite what the law requires.
Yeah, and not only for the evaluations, but also for the IEP. When parents are confirming attendance to the IEP meeting, just to put a note and saying, please remember that I need a certified interpreter at the meeting. So it's always a good way of doing things, is just putting in writing, requesting the evaluations in their language and the interpreter at the meeting. They should do it without a reminder, but we've seen that it works better when parents do send a reminder.
And just another question on timeliness. This person says many independent neuropsychological evaluators are quoting wait lists of a year or longer. Do you have any guidance or advice around how to expedite outside evaluations? Anything in addition to what you just shared?
Yeah, I think calling different evaluators. If you call our helpline,
I was just going to suggest that.
Yeah, we can, because we're sometimes in contact with evaluators and know about, how long the wait is. The hospitals, you can always expect, year and a half, 2 years, like that's, and I wouldn't say that, you necessarily are going to get a better quality evaluation, if you go to one of the big, well-renowned hospitals, in Boston, for example. So definitely call us, and we can make some suggestions regarding independent evaluators who may have shorter wait times.
Yeah, that's what we see in the helpline, that most parents go straight to the hospital when they are looking for independent evaluation. But if you contact the helpline, we might have some other resources where the wait is not going to be, or shouldn't be that long. Should we continue?
Yeah, I know we have a lot more to get to, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about step 2 in the process, the team meeting. So we've talked about the referral for an evaluation and the different types of evaluations. Now we'll talk a little bit about the special education team meeting. So just to say, as this picture shows, I mean, this is actually a pretty small team in this little picture that's on the slide, but it's really overwhelming for parents, team meetings, when you have this room full of experts and teachers and professionals in in child development and education. So your role in those meetings to support families, and if you go to team meetings, if you've been to even more than one, can be a huge source of support to families. So the primary purpose of the team meetings can be to discuss the evaluations, to decide if the child is eligible for special education, asking a series of questions to make that determination. And importantly to note, limited English proficiency must not be a determining factor for students needing special education, or maybe not needing special education. It's a question of teasing out, whether it's the language, any language barrier that's impacting that student's ability to access the curriculum, or whether it's that student's disability that's preventing them from doing, or a combination of the two. And it's the school district's obligation to do appropriate testing and sufficient testing to be able to make an educated determination. Also at team meetings, it's where the IEP is written, or the key components of the IEP are decided. And it's also done before a child's IEP year ends. So they should happen at least yearly, more frequently if needed, if there's some kind of issue, or if there's a disagreement regarding some aspect of the IEP.
Yeah, and I think this is one piece of the special education process where you as a service provider can really support the family to get them prepared for the meeting, making sure they have the evaluations, both in English and their language, that they have all the documentation they need to bring to the meeting, maybe reports from other doctors, reports from a therapist, making sure that the parents write down their questions beforehand. It's always a good idea to have everything in writing and come into the meeting preparing to, these are the concerns that I have that I want to make sure that I address. The meeting goes really fast, especially if we're using an interpreter. They're usually an hour long, but then using an interpreter, it means that they're really 35, 40 minutes long, because it takes twice the time when we're using an interpreter. So it's important for parents to be prepared for that meeting, and then working with you as a service provider, that would be very helpful.
And if the timing has been an issue in the past, especially because of the use of an interpreter, I would absolutely suggest requesting a longer meeting, additional time. Sometimes that will end up happening, and sometimes not, like anything else, but it's worth asking. And here we have a slide preparing for the team meeting. And Lauda has addressed a few of these already, requesting the evaluations in advance, inviting an advocate, a community service provider, an independent expert, or a friend, even writing down parent concerns and questions in advance of the meeting can be really important. It's very easy for parents, for their mind, and I know this as a parent myself, going to team meetings for my children, it's very easy to walk in there and for your mind to just go blank in that moment. So having that list of concerns and questions can be really important. And as Lauda mentioned, addressing the need for a qualified interpreter. You shouldn't have to, but especially if it's been an issue in the past, it's important to raise and to try to get that, to have a qualified interpreter at the meeting. Any questions about the team meeting or anything so far?
Yeah, we've had a bunch come in. This person is asking if this is from earlier in the webinar, is the interpreter portion of the law covered under IDEA?
Yes, it is.
What if the school is still in the process of getting a speech specialist? Should I still consider the 30 days?
if it's the process of getting a speech specialist to conduct the evaluation, they should do that within the 30 days. If the question may be, you know, should they request an evaluation, like a speech evaluation, if the school is already in the process of, you know, getting a speech specialist? I mean, I don't think it hurts to do that if there's some question about what the student needs, just to not have a delay in case, you know, it takes 2 months to get a speech specialist or something like that.
Yeah, and if it's like the school is trying to get this expert that, you know, which means that the evaluation might take a little bit longer, it's important that the school communicates with the parents in writing if they expect that there's going to be a delay. But I mean, it should be within the 30 days anyways. But if the school is projecting any delays, and they should definitely communicate with the parent in their language, and the parent has to consent to that.
Our next question is, does the law allow the parent to accompany a child to an evaluation and be present in the room or the building with the child during the assessment? This is in reference to children who are turning 3.
I don't think that the law explicitly addresses the issue of the parent's right to be there for the evaluation, but I don't know, in my experience, you know, districts are open to accommodating if it's not going to impact their ability to test the child. I know for my son, I waited. I didn't want to be in the room because I thought I'd be a distraction for him. I waited outside the room while they were testing him, but I was there the whole time. So I would suggest talking to the people who will be conducting the evaluation to make sure that there is, you know, something that can be worked out, that the parent is comfortable with, that allows, you know, a kind of accurate assessment, you know, of the child. But if there's something else going on, and there may be, that's why you're asking the question, definitely call Mac's helpline and we can talk through, you know, what's going on and what your options might be.
Thank you. This person says, I support a family where the mom speaks and reads Portuguese. During COVID, her second graders' assignments were all in English, and the mom was struggling to read them and explain them to her child because of the language barrier. Do you have advice for this person?
We saw this so much in our helpline, unfortunately. Yes.
Yeah. So the district so at this point, if the student is still learning remotely, if there's still advocacy that needs to happen there, the district is obligated to provide additional support in that instance. And, you know, it may be translating the assignments into the parent's language if that's what is needed for the parent to be able to support the child. It may be adding an hour a week or, you know, or more of direct instruction for that student to be able to access the material and get the support that the child needs to be able to learn. If the child is no longer learning remotely and it's no longer as much of an issue, then something to consider would be raising this in requesting COVID compensatory services, because that's definitely an access barrier, and that student, you know, is definitely impacted. You know, the student who requires that support and wasn't able to get it in the same way that a student whose parent was able to read the information that was being provided in the assignment. So I would suggest now, and thinking about really what would make that child whole at this point, like thinking through and really proposing something specific to the special education team. in terms of compensatory services, something that's going to make a difference and that the parent agrees with, will be useful to that child to compensate them for the gap, in services and instruction they had.
And I just shared the helpline number again if you want to talk about that specific case more in depth with us. We have, and we also have some frequently asked questions about compensatory services, so I'll share that in a second. We have one more question. Is there a guidance to explain to families what testing is for and if it's required? I think this is about evaluations.
I mean, the law is pretty clear. IDEA and Massachusetts special education law is pretty clear on which evaluations are required. And if you email me after the webinar, I can send you the sites to the law. It's actually, piece by piece, it's actually fairly readable. But it's just a matter of finding it. And so I would be happy to send that to you. I'm not aware of a guidance. I mean, that's a really good idea. Actually, to have a guidance in plain language, just about evaluations. There isn't one that I'm aware of. Maybe with the exception of, I know there's an assist, I always get it wrong, the augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC. There is a guidance specifically on that does address evaluations, AAC evaluations, but I'm not aware of any others. Not to say that they don't exist, but none that I'm aware of. But please do email me, and I can send you the sites to the law where it lays out which evaluations are required and can give some description of the evaluations.
Okay, so we continue with the presentation.
Okay, so now we are going to talk about the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, or the IEP is a very important document. It's the contract, essentially, that outlines the services and supports that the district is required to provide to the student because of their disability. Those are that is what the student needs in order to learn due to their disability. So the school district must provide the IEP, the proposed IEP, to the parents within 45 school working days of receiving parent consent for the evaluations. And the parents must respond to the IEP within 30 days of receiving it. And it's a very complicated document. We're not going to have time to talk about every section of the IEP in a lot of depth, but the sections are listed here. Just, as we mentioned before, the parent and student concerns, that's an area where it's important to go into the meeting with a clear idea of what the parent is most concerned with, even to have it in writing. I mean, the parent can send it directly to the IEP team chair and ask them just to put the parent's words into that section of the IEP. That can be helpful because, even the goals, if the parent wants a goal that is going to address some area of concern for the parent in terms of their child's skill development, that's something that the parent can advocate for. To give one example, and it's very important to have, those concerns documented in the IEP.
Yeah, and one thing, I'm sorry, Diana.
Go ahead. No,
okay. So I think it's important here, especially in this COVID or maybe after COVID, the IEPs should be drafted based on full-time in-person services. So we saw sometimes in helpline when we were remote, the schools were drafting IEPs, taking away services because they couldn't be delivered during COVID. That should not be the case. The IEP, doesn't matter if the kid is remote and hybrid, it should be drafted based on full-time in-person learning. We've seen, and we're now seeing, now that we're going to the end of the school year, team meetings where they want to take away services, or they want to take away the IEP because the kid did so well during remote learning. And that's going to be the issue, because the team cannot be making these changes without actually seeing the child back in the classroom with full in-time, in-person services before determining any changes to that IEP. So just be mindful that these things are happening, but the schools cannot remove any goal services just because the child was okay doing remote learning without understanding the level of support that maybe the child was having from mom at home, or maybe the child was just feeling less anxious because didn't have the social content or the sensory piece in the classroom, so was able to work better at home. So we need to wait and see how our kids are doing in classroom full time before having a team meeting where they are, they might be suggesting taking services away.
Yeah, pandemic, definitely not the right time to terminate eligibility for special education services after what students have been through. So, so that's, yeah, that should absolutely not be happening, and even to reduce services that are being included in the IEP. So yeah, these are just some examples of what IEP services can be. I mean, really, it can be, question. You can answer that question, and I'll just keep talking. But what's important to keep in mind in terms of the IEP services is that they're individualized to the student's needs. So really anything that student needs to learn as a result of their disability to be able to access their learning is on the table in terms of IEP services. And for English learner students, and maybe even now more during COVID, where English learner students with disabilities have been home, have been in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, disproportionately learning from home. Native language instruction and native language support may be something that that student needs to be able to access their learning. And so that's something that parents may want to consider and advocate for. But really, it can be anything. It can be, that will enable that student to make progress. So let's see what the results are to the survey.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's concerning because it can be really hard to go back. It can be hard to go back and add services that have been eliminated from the IEP. So that's just something for you all to be looking out for, if especially for students who that maybe they're still remote learning, and their parents plan to keep them remote through the summer. They've already gone to their annual review now, remotely, after several months of remote learning. And it's kind of easy to lose track of what that student needs and when they're in school. So here we have the service delivery grid, and this is a sample service delivery grid, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. And it's just really important to compare it. It describes, what the type of service, who is required to provide that service, how often they're required to provide it, and in what setting they're required to provide that service. So whether it's a consultation just directly to the school staff, or to the parents, that is never kind of directly with the student, that would be in the top portion, the portion labeled as A. If it's in the general education classroom, so that's in with students who have disabilities and students who do not have disabilities, then it would be listed under the B grid, what's referred to as the B grid. And if that student requires services outside of the general education classroom, for a portion of the day or for all of the day, then that should be listed in the C portion of the service delivery grid. And it can be a really important, useful tool to compare when the parent receives a proposed IEP, to compare it with the prior IEP, just to make sure that there haven't been any changes that kind of slip by the parent at the team meeting, to make sure that they agree, with what's in the service delivery grid. The IEP and English learners. So this is one, bilingualism is a strength, and the team should really address the students' bilingualism, as such, not as a problem that needs to be overcome. And the IEP should really reflect this. And the team should encourage parents to be speaking with their children at home in their primary language. The team must discuss. Oh, go ahead, Laura.
No, I was going to say that sometimes they comments, the student is having a difficulty reading, and they'll say, well, it's because he's bilingual, and that should not be the case. I mean, they should be really looking into maybe a learning difficulty there that is not related to being bilingual. So that we've seen that sometimes the school will say, no, we don't need to do an evaluation because the student is bilingual, and that's why the delay in speech or the delay in reading, and that definitely should not be an excuse to not evaluate the child.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The special education team must discuss the impact of language needs of the student with LEP or the English learner student related to their special education needs. The team must consider whether primary language instruction is necessary for that student to receive FAPE. You can imagine for a student who receiving all instruction in English, let's say even without a disability that impacts their learning, and how hard it would be to keep up. Think about reading, think about writing, math, word problems, all of those things. It's an extra layer. And then you add the disability on top of that. It can be a lot. It can be unreasonable. Too much to expect the student to be able to keep up, and that native language or primary language instruction can be really key in kind of closing the gaps, especially after COVID. And the district must indicate specific needs and required instruction to address language needs throughout the IEP. We'll stop quickly for questions, and then, maybe for 3 minutes for questions.
So it looks like we don't have any questions, but I am going to take this opportunity to ask people to click the link to the survey that I'll share in the chat box. The survey is optional, but it does give us important information we can use to improve these webinars. So we hope you'll fill it out, and anyone who fills out the survey will receive a link to today's recording. So let me just share that and give everyone a minute to click that link and save it. And then I know we have a lot more information to get to, so
yeah,
let's keep going.
Okay, so the transition requirements, there are 2 points of transition in special education, actually 3 if you count the exit from special education, but the first is turning 3. And the important thing to keep in mind is that before the child's 3rd birthday, the district must provide the IEP and services if the child is eligible. I'm sorry, they don't need to provide the services, but that IEP should be in place and ready to go on the child's 3rd birthday. So eval's done, everything, IEP in place with enough time for the parent to review. And then turning 14, I mentioned transition assessments to services at school and in the community. It's not enough to be in a classroom, learning about, applying for a job or, how to conduct yourself in an interview. That may be a start, but there really need to be experiences, at school and also in the community for students to be able to develop the skills that they will need to be as independent as possible after high school. And that can be, for work, for higher education, and independent living. And there are programs that allow students with disabilities. The Massachusetts Inclusive Concurrent Enrollment Initiative, for example, that provides supports for students with disabilities, including students with intellectual disabilities, to learn on a college campus with support. At 14, also important to note is the student will be invited to the team meeting. It, becomes a member of the special education team. So it's important to plan for that.
And this is a piece of the IEP that we've seen. There's been a lot of struggles during COVID because of the restrictions. And students in these transition services have not had the opportunity to really be out in the community, have jobs experiences, or really connecting with other members of the community, which is so important for our kids during this transition process. So just know that if that's the case, the student is might be eligible for compensatory services. Want to make sure that those transition services are in before the student ages out from school. We have students who are actually, instead of graduating 18, now they're going to 19 or 20 just because they didn't have those transition services in place. So make sure that that is addressed for the student if it's a transition age student. And if any questions, well, just contact the helpline.
Okay, placement, IEP placement it's a decision made by the IEP team. And the team can only consider the needs of the child, the unique needs of the child, not the cost of the placement, whether there are enough seats available in that placement, how expensive it is. A placement also must consider the inclusion with non-disabled students as much as possible, regardless of grade level and that of the student. So if a student, let's say they have an intellectual disability and is a second grade student learning at the kindergarten grade level, that's not a reason to not include a student with non-disabled peers, just to provide one example. And that's the idea of the least restrictive environment. There are many placement types, ranging from full inclusion, which is the least restrictive, to residential. And even full inclusion can allow for some time, up to 20% outside of the general education setting. So it's really important to consider, when it's really important for that student to be pulled out and when they can be in the general education setting. Parent response to the IEP. There are 3 options in responding to the IEP. So this whole process has happened, the evals, the team meeting, the IEP is there, that 12 or 13-page document. And the parent has 3 options in responding. They can accept fully the IEP, saying, I agree with this. This is great. There's nothing more I would want, nothing less that my child needs. They can fully accept the IEP and hand it back to the school district, and it will be implemented. They can fully reject the IEP, which means that they don't agree with anything that's in the IEP. Although, many parents do this because they're frustrated and they aren't sure what to do. And so they're like, well, I can't accept it. So I'm just going to fully reject it because I don't know what else to do. And the parent can, the impact of that is just that the district will just use the last accepted IEP. So they'll just continue implementing whatever IEP is in place until the student, the parent accepts in part a different IEP. And then the third option is to partially reject the IEP and partially accept the IEP, highlighting the areas where the parent is making either additional requests or requests for changes in the IEP. So for example, if the parent agrees the student needs special education services, agrees that they should be in a partial inclusion setting, but the parent feels that they're being pulled out of the classroom, out of the general education setting too much, and that they don't need to be pulled out for their speech services. Well, they can reject that the speech services are being provided in a separate setting and request that those services be provided in general education, just to provide one example But it's the whole range of services that parent may reject in part. It's always helpful to have that independent evaluation as backup support too, if the parent is going to partially reject. So really important to highlight these rights. Probably the most, maybe after the independent eval, maybe one of the most important protections that parents of children with disabilities have and students have is that if the parent partially rejects the elimination of services or services being dropped from the IEP, if they partially reject that in writing, say, no, I don't agree that my child no longer needs occupational therapy, then those services must continue until the parent and the school district agree, or until a hearing officer decides that the child either needs those services or does not need those services going forward. And those are referred to as stay put rights. So that's very important. And it applies to placement too. If the school district is proposing to move the child from a general education setting or full inclusion placement to a substantially separate classroom, the parent doesn't agree. The parent says that, rejects that proposed placement, the student must continue in the full inclusion placement until, again, an agreement is reached between the parents and the school, or that the matter goes to a hearing and a hearing officer decides. So if there's that kind of disagreement, it's always just really important to get an independent evaluation. And similar with services not added to the IEP, the parent doesn't have the stay put rights that are so valuable. But it's still important to document, if there's an IEE that recommends an independent educational evaluation that makes a certain recommendation that is not reflected in the IEP, it's important to note that regardless. And it's not as though the district automatically is just going to add those. They're not legally obligated, to do that necessarily if they don't agree that the student needs those services, but it's still important to have that documented. And here we have some considerations. And Laura, why don't do you want to do that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So we're going to talk a little bit about considerations under COVID. Although we've been covering that throughout the presentation, but the in-person learning, determine the supports needed for a smooth transition. We are also happy that the kids are going back to school, hooray, hooray. But, it might be that the student now has some more challenges that they didn't have before. It might be that the transition, which is going to be a big transition for many of our kids, and then make sure that we have that communication with the school and putting a plan together for that transition into in-person learning. Proactively provide instructions, support, social skills. The important piece here is discipline is supposed to be used as last resort. We know, again, it's going to be a big transition for our kids. We're expecting that kids might have some behaviors they didn't have before, just going back into the in-person learning. So these changes in behavior and learning style should be viewed as a team coming together and evaluating the situation as a special education situation and not as a disciplinary situation. And again, regular two-way communication, the parent's primary language. And IEPs must be fully implemented. In remote learning, well, we know that our families can choose to stay in remote learning throughout the end of the school year. If they're staying remote learning, these are the guidelines of how many synchronous instruction they should have, and they should be interacting with teachers each school day. There shouldn't be any day where the student is just given packets or work they have to do independently online without checking with any teachers throughout the day. And same as in-person learning, remote learning, the IEPs must be implemented fully. We talked a little bit throughout the presentation about compensatory services. So if the student because of COVID wasn't able to access some of the services, they might be eligible for compensatory services, which means that all of those services that students didn't receive, then now the team needs to reconvene and make a plan on when, how, and who is going to deliver those services that had to be suspended during COVID, or simply you have many students who were not able to really engage online via Zoom. So in many cases, these services that could have been provided via Zoom, the student just wasn't able to engage and remotely. So those are also services that we can see being delivered through compensatory services. We are getting a lot of calls on our helplines about compensatory services. And so if you have any questions, please reach out. And then the extended school year for this year, the districts are directed to plan for in-person extended school year, but the families still have the choice to choose the remote learning for during extended school year for those students who are eligible for extended school year. And other summer education in-person programs should accommodate all students with disabilities. Yeah, so what, 3 minutes to spare for more questions. So while we answer questions, I don't know, Lilia, if we have any more questions there, I'm gonna put these slides here to share information about mediation and PRS.
And that's if, the parent's gone through this whole process, the whole special education process, the evaluations, the team meeting, the response to the IEP, the second meeting after they say they disagree with the IEP, and still cannot, the independent evaluation, they can't reach an agreement with the school district, then these are options that they may want to consider. The exception of PRS that can happen at any time, but in terms of mediation or the hearing with the Bureau of Special Education Appeals, and PRS for language issues, or if the district is not following timelines, for example. Here's some takeaway points, our information again. Are there any questions, Lilia?
You want to mention just quick talk here, just to make sure that everyone knows that we have a series of special education videos in our website, and you have all the different topics here, and the videos are in English and Spanish, so they can be very valuable resource for our families in both languages.
Thank you, Laura. And we'll be sending these resources in a follow-up email as well. If you'd like to receive a recording, please fill out that survey. Just share that again. And also, if you follow us on social media, our resources and our most up-to-date resources and news are all available there. So I would recommend doing that.
And if you do speak Spanish, definitely join our Facebook, Mac Español. It's a Facebook group. Just type in Mass Advocates for Children Español and ask to join the group, and we share resources there and answer questions from families.
And you as service providers in different communities, please feel free to post resources in the Facebook group too.
Absolutely, I'm just pulling that up so I can share the link. We have a question. I'm not sure what this means, but this person says, have you heard some districts are saying that dyslexia and autism are medical diagnoses?
Well, sometimes we hear that there's a diagnosis from a hospital and that it's a medical diagnosis and doesn't impact the child's learning. We do hear that sometimes. But definitely, if there's a concern about that, definitely, call our helpline and we can talk through that. And the helpline number is here on the slide. Really, we'll put it in the chat, but I think we're going to sign off now. We're after 2 o'clock, but thank you all so much for joining and for your participation. And please do fill out the survey and definitely contact Max Helpline if you have questions. about a specific case or anything about the webinar. And thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Lilia and Diana.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.